pause, whether it's a ceasefire or an end to the hostilities, probably suits Russia as well at the moment. My worry is that they may suit them in the near term, not in the long term, and therefore in the long term, something needs to be done to protect Ukraine, to protect Ukrainians, and to stop Russia revisiting this fight in a few years' time.
And what could be a key for ensuring that Russia will not invade Ukraine again in the future after, for example, a ceasefire deal? Only US or European deployment to Ukraine, military presence here?
There have been a number of different options talked about, Daniel, including having United Nations forces on the ground. I'm a bit skeptical about that. United Nations forces are a political tool. They aren't always that effective militarily. And therefore, I think we have to be very careful that if you deploy United Nations forces and Russia decides to push again, that would massively undermine the credibility of the United Nations and the West. I think far more credible will be some bilateral or trilateral military arrangements with Ukraine and potentially the West, whether that's America, the UK, France, Poland, other nations, that all of which deploy maybe semi-permanent forces into Ukraine so that an attack on Ukraine is an attack on those forces as well. And that would create a seed of doubt in President Putin's mind that would say that there's more to risk by going again than to gain. My worry, of course, in all of this is that we are heading towards some form of potential negotiation. If that happens, it's very difficult to see Russia not emerging from that with a 20% stake of territory from Ukraine, and he will sell it as a win. It will be seen as a win by China, North Korea, Iran, and that has incredibly difficult implications for our global national security. So I'm not entirely sure that peace talks which hand President Putin a win are going to be credible, but unfortunately it does appear we're heading that way. Ultimately, though, it is up to President Zelensky to decide the future for Ukraine. It's just not looking good in terms of choices at the moment.
Also, European officials are urging Trump's administration to commit several thousand troops to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine in case of a ceasefire. According to Bloomberg, only American military presence will make this peacekeeping mission a credible one. What is your reaction to this? And do you believe that only US military presence will make this mission a credible one?
I think there are a couple of issues here, Daniel. I think American presence on the ground would be a very powerful deterrent for President Putin. Unfortunately, I don't think that's coherent with where President Trump's head is at the moment. I think he has been very critical of NATO. He's been very critical of nations within NATO that believe that they can just hide under the umbrella of security that NATO provides, but not pay their way. And therefore, he wants to encourage European NATO countries to step up, not only with money, but also military capability and equipment onto the ground. So I suspect he will not see Ukraine as an American problem. He will see this as a great example of a European challenge and will therefore be pushing very hard, not only for European countries to get involved and find a solution, but also use this as a catalyst to increase defence spending across Europe. You'll know that he's currently seeking 5% of GDP for NATO countries. It used to be NATO was setting a target of 2%, and there are still a third of NATO countries that fail to meet that low bar. If it goes up to 3%, 4%, or 5%, which is exactly what America is seeking to achieve, that will certainly provide the West with a more robust military deterrence. But whether those politicians have the appetite for that at the moment, we'll have to wait and see.
Let's cover also Vladimir Putin and Kremlin. Russian dictator Putin believes that he has achieved key objectives in the war against Ukraine, according to Reuters. However, Putin is frustrated about the state of Russia's economy. Meanwhile, Russian elite becoming more favorable to the peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine, according to the Reuters sources. Don't you think that these developments can indicate Russia's willingness to settle the war, to negotiate a ceasefire?
Daniel, that may be true, but it does feel more like hope than expectation. As we've said before, I think sanctions do have an impact on Russia's economy. There is no doubt that inflationary pressures are building. That with, I think it's about 30% of spending now on defense, that this is not a sustainable model for Russia. However, if I put myself in the leadership shoes of Putin, I would be pushing very hard at the moment so that when, not if, there is a negotiation, that he's in a very strong position. That's why I believe, even though it's winter, even though there's no undergrowth to hide behind, even though it's very difficult to dig trenches in the ground, and traditionally Russia has not been on the offensive in the winter, they have been pushing very hard this winter despite the losses. All of that appears to indicate that Russia is trying to get itself into as strong as possible position, ready for that negotiation. I think that's also coherent. If you remember, the Ukrainians did an invasion of Russia into the Kursk region. And although Ukraine has been pushed out of a good proportion of that enclave now, it still has a very credible military presence. And I think Putin has been pushing hard in the Donbass to try to force Ukraine to pull out its forces. And it's also been using North Korean forces in the Kursk region to try to bolster up the Russian effort. But Ukraine has held firm. It is still having a robust defense. And therefore, it looks likely, if we do end up with some sort of negotiation, that Ukraine's holding some of the territory in Russia might be a useful bargaining chip as well. But back to your central question, do we think that pressures building on Putin will force him to the table? I don't think so. Will they be an element, a factor? I have no doubt that he would like to see the war end. He does not know just how powerful his support is back in Russia, because he controls all of the media. But it's pretty clear that the oligarchs, the generals, where the real power lies, they cannot be happy with the way this war is going. They cannot be happy with the various sanctions, that they're not able to live their lives and enjoy their wealth. There's no doubt pressure is building on Putin, but whether that crack in the dam opens in the next day, week, months, or years, it's very difficult to tell.
Also, US President Donald Trump says that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to make a deal, but Trump is not really confident about whether Putin would like to make a deal. From your perspective, why is there such focus on President Zelensky's willingness to settle the war, to make a deal?
I think we've got to be careful, Daniel, about the language here. You know, President Trump has made his fortune around doing deals. You're hired, you're fired. He's made his fortune in real estate, and he knows that a deal is to be done. That's what he puts and he's doing that with American foreign policy. He's doing that with a lot of the headlines that he's been grabbing and some of the orders that he's been signing in the first week of his time. What he's effectively saying is, this war isn't to anybody's benefit. We need to bring it to a close. The concern is that, of course, Trump will be simply concerned with having successfully ceased the war in Ukraine, having that on his CV. The problem is that if you don't resolve the underlying problems, in other words, create the security for Ukraine long term, make it clear that Putin is not rewarded for these ambitions, then the danger is what next? We haven't even talked about Belarus, but that's another country in which Russia has been gradually seizing control of. It hasn't attacked militarily, but it's now got itself embedded in that country. And almost certainly that will be the next prize that President Putin will effectively seize. This is not the end of not the beginning of the end with Ukraine. It looks like the end of the beginning.
What would it take for US President Donald Trump to help Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength?
I think that depends on what the position of strength is. I as a military guy, I say I don't believe sanctions are going to solve this.